The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975 marked one of the most significant defeats for the United States during the Cold War, leading to a reassessment of American foreign policy and military interventions. I spoke with Brian Becker, director of the Answer Coalition.
I met Becker at our studios in Washington, D.C.
The fall of Saigon, the Vietnam War, such a defining moment here in the United States, I think politically and on a number of different levels. How do you define it? I mean, how do you describe that era and what it means?
Well, that was a defining era, certainly for my generation. I was drafted when I was 19 years old in 1971. For that whole generation of younger people, we were basically in the streets protesting against a war. That anti-war protest escalated year after year. For the U.S. government, it was a trying time because it represented basically the fracturing of an earlier post-World War II consensus. Certainly the United States, when it went to war in Vietnam, went sort of step by step. There wasn't a plan for an all-out invasion of Vietnam, which actually ultimately happened in 1964. And I think the U.S. policymakers were guided by the notion that with this many bombers, this many missiles, this many bombs, certainly that they would win in Vietnam. Say between 1965 and 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. dropped carpet bomb North and South Vietnam for 156 weeks. About 180,000 civilians, according to the Pentagon's own estimates, died in those 3 years. And it accomplished nothing from a military point of view. It hardened Vietnamese resistance. It didn't break the will of the Vietnamese to fight. So you could also see that the empire, the US empire, was never an announced empire, but it certainly functioned like one at the end of World War II, was brought down by a country that was smaller than the size of Texas. And the US dropped 7 million plus tons of bombs and missiles on Vietnam. That was 3 times more than were dropped by the United States during all of World War II, the biggest, bloodiest war we had ever experienced, and yet the U.S. lost. So it was a big wake-up call that might doesn't always make right, and might doesn't even necessarily guarantee victory. So the political military equations that were driving the war, I think, were basically shattered.
Brian Becker is a leader of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Becker has been a central organizer of the mass anti-war demonstrations that have taken place in Washington, D.C. over the past decade.
Let me take it back to the personal level, because you brought it up. 71, you're drafted. Just kind of take us back in time. What was it like to be a young person like yourself with, you don't know what your fate's going to be?
Well, the Vietnam War worked its way into the kitchen table in every family kitchen. In the United States. Why? Because of the selective service, because of the draft. It's not like the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War where you have a volunteer army. Every young person in the United States in 1965, say who was my age, then 14, would think, well, when I'm 18, I might be drafted. I might go to Vietnam. Same with my brothers. And so each and every family had to take up the discussion, well, what is it going to mean for our children to go to Vietnam, thousands of miles away to fight in these jungles? What is it for? And so it brought the war home in a very sort of tangible way. I think that's one of the reasons the Pentagon got rid of the selective service after the war, so that the war seemed very far away instead of in everybody's living room or kitchen. But when you were 15 years old, you thought, oh, the war will be over in a couple of years. By the time I'm 18 or 19, it'll be over. And then when you're 17, it's like, still not over. By the time you're 19, in my case, I was 19, and I won the lottery. I was number 6. My birthday came up number 6. So I got my draft notice in 1971. So for a whole generation of young people, men and women, boys and girls, but their parents as well, they were talking about what happens if our kids go to Vietnam? What is it for? Is it worth it? Now, in World War II, when my father went into the war, there was no question about whether or not that was a good idea. He and all the people his age either were drafted, or if they weren't drafted, they enlisted. They thought the war was the right thing. They were fighting fascism in Europe, or Japanese imperialism and militarism in Asia. The United States government could never make that case really with the American people. So over time, as it became clear that the war was unwinnable, as the casualty numbers went up and up, 58,000 Americans died, 400,000 were wounded, 75,000 were severely disabled, and I'm not talking about the millions of Vietnamese who died. People woke up every morning and were confronted with the newspaper about the body count in Vietnam. Every morning we looked at the headlines. 150 Viet Cong were killed. The enemy was always terrorists. They weren't just people. But nonetheless, this kind of seeped into everyone's consciousness, and along with this American civil rights movement, became the dominant generation shifting issue for the entire population.
You know, I remember my brother was drafted and he went off and he came back on leave. And I was a kid, you know, I grew up on John Wayne and Heroes and all of this sort of thing. And I remember saying to him, we were out in a swimming pool, and I remember this vividly. I remember saying to him, I want to be just like you. You know, when I get to be old enough, I want to go off. And I remember how angry he got at me, turning to me and said, personally, when that happens, I'm driving you to Canada. And these are the kind of discussions that were going on in families. If we go back in time, how did young Brian Becker, how did all of these events shape who he is today, do you think?
Well, my parents were actually active in the civil rights movement. They were liberal people, they were progressive people. They were not ideological or very political people, but they were involved in the civil rights movement, like many white families who were motivated by the need to get rid of the extreme racism, the apartheid character of America. So from a young age, I was actually going to meetings that were about civil rights. So as I matured, by the time I was 15 or 16, I was paying a lot of attention to politics, to US foreign policy. And I became an anti-war organizer when I was 16 years old. The first time I was arrested for protesting against the war in Vietnam was on New Year's Eve when I was 16. I didn't mean to get arrested, but we were all arrested because it didn't take much in those days to get arrested. And actually, when I got my draft notice when I was 19, I couldn't be immediately conscripted because I had criminal charges from another anti-war protest where, again, we were on the sidewalk but just swept up. So we were awaiting trial. And as it turns out, if you were facing trial, you can't be drafted. So
that was beneficial.
A certain advantage to having been arrested in that instance. But, you know, it was like that. I mean, I really felt as an 18-year-old, America was going to sort of bust open. I really felt we were on the verge of almost like a civil war. The polarization was so great, the intensity of people's feelings. The war was such an emotional issue because it wasn't abstract. Your friends were coming back, if not dead, they were coming back horribly wounded. I mean, if not physical wounds, mentally wounded. Drug addiction from soldiers and Marines and sailors coming back. That was ravaging communities. So I think it was kind of a transformational moment. I think the generation, my generation of the 60s, was generally more progressive, leaning more to the left as a consequence of the experience of Vietnam.
The U.S. launched a massive helicopter evacuation, airlifting over 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese allies from the U.S. Embassy and other locations in Saigon.
There's the old saying, history has a way of repeating itself.
First as tragedy, then as farce.
Yeah, well, parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan, Iraq, what do you see?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of parallels. I mean, you had the United States fight in Vietnam for 15 years, and even though it had military superiority, it couldn't win. The United States couldn't defeat the Vietnamese. The American soldier wanted to go home, the Vietnamese soldier was home. You look at Afghanistan, the U.S. Was in Afghanistan for 20 years. The American soldier wanted to go home, the Afghan guerrilla fighter was home. And so ultimately, the people who live there win. Obviously, Afghanistan and Vietnam, very different countries, very different ideologies, but that element, that feature played itself out again.
Following reunification, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam sought international recognition, joining the United Nations in 1977, as it attempted to normalize relations with Western and regional powers.
So the fall of Saigon happens 50 years ago. And you're out there on the streets prior to that. And today, kind of the same arguments you're making are kind of the same arguments you made then. Is it just collective amnesia, or is it just that it's too hard to break that kind of Western narrative? What's at work here?
Well, I think there are two big factors that drive war. One, war is big business in America. There's a lot of money to be made. You know, when a global confrontation breaks out, arms manufacturers' stocks start to go up. You can just read the Wall Street Journal, and they're like, it's good for big business. Lots of money to be made. And if weapons get destroyed in a war, they'll be replenished. And who pays for it? American taxpayers. So it's kind of outside the free market, outside of the risk of competition. It's guaranteed profits for arms manufacturers. But then there are also in the United States, in the Congress, but outside of the Congress, lobbies that exercise a lot of influence, demanding that the U.S. take a confrontational stance. And then I think politicians in America normally start to have their knees tremble, say, well, I don't want to look weak. I used to think having good relations with China was a good idea, but if I say that now, I'm going to be attacked for being soft on communism or soft on China. And again, these are driven by pro-war lobbies in the United States. And they have different motivations for why these lobbies exist. Some is money, some is politics, some is ideology. But I think that's the problem in America is the media doesn't really reflect the genuine sentiment that exists among American people, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, who are sick and tired of endless war. You know, we went from Korea to Vietnam. We had 2 wars in Iraq. We had the Afghanistan war, the Libya war, the Yugoslav war, the war in Panama. You know, it's endless war with the United States, and most people in the United States aren't actually for that. These are decisions made by politicians actually without the consent of the people.
You talked about the power of the lobby. I remember talking to somebody overseas. You know, I've traveled quite a bit, and they were asking me, well, how does this lobbying thing work? And I explained it to them, and they said, oh, yeah, we sort of have that in our country too, but we call it corruption. You know, like you pay off people to kind of, and I'd never kind of seen it that way, framed that way. What about the framing of it's perfectly okay for these people to, you know, have tons and tons of money to influence these politicians who are working in, as you say, in opposition to what their constituents actually want?
Yeah, I would say the American lobbying system is a form of legalized corruption. Because obviously corporations that have lots of money to be made, let's say from war, can come to the United States and they can dish out money. They can put politicians on airplanes and send them to conferences overseas. They can wine them and dine them. And we're told this is democracy. Again, most places in the world would think, no, this is buying politicians. This is corruption. This is the problem, I would say, in the American political system. The 2024 election, $16 billion was spent on the electoral process. Now, that means you have to have a lot of money, or you have to be able to access people or corporations that have a lot of money. That means money dominates. So are we a democracy of buy-in for the people, or are we a plutocracy of buy-in for money? And the money comes in the form of lobbying. It's been codified as something that exists in American politics. When I was a kid, we never were told, hey, this is just out and out blatant corruption. But it is. I mean, K Street, where the lobbyists are, there are 15,000 lobbyists here in Washington, D.C. They are the shadow government in Washington, D.C., because it's they who have the pocketfuls of money that are distributed to the politicians in the name of lobbying, but it's buying or selling politicians.
After the fall of Saigon, the U.S. and its allies imposed economic sanctions on Vietnam, leading to severe hardships that persisted until the country embraced market reforms in the 1980s.
You talked about the kitchen table kind of issue as this was unfolding, that families had these conversations around the kitchen table. How did the media shape perceptions on the war then, and how is war reporting different today, or is it the same?
Well, the war reporting in Vietnam was the first time the American people who weren't at the battle, not in the battlefield, could actually see a conflict almost in real time. But it was the first time that the horror of war started to reflect itself in the American media. And something really dramatic happened around 1968. Walter Cronkite was the kind of the news voice of America for CBS. The US only had 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. So there was a very limited sort of place that you were getting your media. In 1968, Walter Cronkite said after the Tet Offensive, where the US Embassy in Saigon was seized by Vietnamese guerrillas, he looked into the camera and he said, "There is no light at the end of this tunnel." That was a big one because Walter Cronkite had this kind of grandfatherly sage status as like the #1 American newsman. And he's telling the American people who the next year, like in these kitchen table discussions, we're having to decide, does my son go or do we say no? And he's telling the American people there's no light at the end of this tunnel, meaning if you send your kid, it's not for something, there's no end sight. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. It's for nothing. And so that was a big eye-opener for the American people. And then in 1969, and I can give you a direct example of how the American media shaped American public opinion. In 1969, there were 2 demonstrations. They were the biggest protests in American history up until that day. They were called the Moratorium. One was in October 1969, and the other was November. In both months, 500,000 people came to Washington, D.C. I was organizing buses as a 16-year-old in my church in Rochester, New York, and we had 3 buses ready to go the Monday before the Saturday protest. And then that night, the network TV started saying, well, there's this demonstration happening in Washington, D.C., and it's going to be really good, and so many people are coming to it. It was like suddenly we got sympathetic media coverage, and from Monday, we had 3 buses. By Thursday, we had 20 buses. This is from a small town in Rochester, New York. So the media, I think decisions by media policymakers to sort of tell the other side of the Vietnam War changed American public opinion. So there was a difference of opinion that was aired on nightly TV. That you don't see too much now. Or if you see it, it's based on like, I watch MSNBC, you watch Fox News. But at that time, everyone watched either CBS, ABC, or NBC. So the media had a very profound impact.
Decades later, the fall of Saigon is viewed differently depending on the country. While it remains a moment of loss for Vietnamese exiles and U.S. veterans, it is commemorated in Vietnam as Reunification Day, and in the West, it serves as a cautionary tale about military intervention.
One final question. You brought about this question about, there's going to be a bloodbath, and there really wasn't a bloodbath, and that was kind of the narrative. The other narrative was that the United States will never be able to work with Vietnam, and yet right now, the economic relationship is a very good one, which gets back to the earlier point, which is, why? I mean, what was the point? Is that a lesson that has sunk in or not?
Yeah, I think it's an extremely significant lesson from Vietnam. The U.S. went to war. Millions of people died because the U.S. said we could never be friends. We could only be enemies with Vietnam. Today, the United States has what it announces to be a strategic partnership with Vietnam, led by the Communist Party of Vietnam. So obviously, the entire notion that the United States and Vietnam could not work together, that either one side had to win and the other side had to be defeated. Well, the U.S. was actually defeated in Vietnam, but it was a false notion. And again, does the United States have to go to war with China? Did it have to prepare for World War III with the Soviet Union? These are the war lobbies, the ideologues, the ones who are driven by certain notions that really put common sense to the side. And I think the big lesson of Vietnam is that the war was completely 100% unnecessary. And so all of those people died for nothing.
We'll leave it there. Brian, thank you.